Okay, thank you very much for joining us today again for the Best of the Biennial Cancer Survivorship Research Conference. My name is Shira Morales, and I am the Project Manager for Healthcare Professional Education at the GW Cancer Institute. Before we get started, I would like to take a few minutes to go over some housekeeping remarks. We ask that everyone keep their phones on mute to avoid any background noise and disruption during the program. Also, today's program is being recorded. We will use the question and answer feature for this webinar. You will see the Q&A box at the bottom right hand of your screen. If at any time during the presentation you have a question, please type it in and we will address it during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. These questions are anonymous and I will repeat the question for the presenters. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to write the questions in the Q&A box as we go, and we will make sure to answer them during the time allotted. We will also use the chat box feature, which is on the top right side of your screen. You can use the chat box to interact with each other. Because we will be talking during the presentation, we probably will not be able to keep up with the chat. So if you want to ask a question, just make sure you use the Q&A box on the bottom right. And as a note, before we get started, we will send out a PDF of the slides and a link to the archived webinar, and as well as all the other webinars to the participants. The recording will be archived and will be found on our website. I would like to take a quick moment to review today's agenda. I will provide a brief overview of the Center for the Advancement of Cancer Survivorship Navigation and Policy. Dr. Lynne Padgett will provide an overview of the Biennial Cancer Conference that took place this year in Atlanta, and we will then move into our presentations. We will conclude the webinar with participant Q&A, and will do so through the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your screen. I want to provide you with a brief overview of the Center for the Advancement of Cancer Survivorship Navigation and Policy, which brings you today's webinar. The Center for the Advancement of Cancer Survivorship Navigation and Policy, which we affectionately call CA-SNAP, was created in 2009 through a generous grant from the Pfizer Global Health Partnerships Program. The mission of the center is to advance cancer survivorship and patient navigation efforts locally and nationally through education and training, policy analysis, outreach, and research. The center offers survivorship and navigation resources that are available online at our website and through a monthly e-newsletter. Additional materials is sent through the CA-SNAP listserv to over 2,200 subscribers. We write white papers, create case studies, and work cooperatively with other healthcare organizations to advance patient-centered care. We also share summaries of meetings and roundtables we have hosted to catalyze patient navigation, cancer survivorship, and patient-centered care initiatives. Through CA-SNAP, we have offered several trainings. We were recently awarded funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that will help us translate our existing in-person trainings to an online format to make them available at no charge for participants. We will start with our executive training on navigation and survivorship, which is the nuts and bolts training for building and sustaining navigation and survivorship programs. We will also be developing a competency-based patient navigator training that will be available through our online academy. Today's webinar is part of the CA-SNAP monthly webinar series, which launched in April 2013. We feature a variety of topics related to navigation and survivorship based on feedback from healthcare professionals across the country. We also have several research initiatives that we provide updates through on CA-SNAP. You can find archived webinars on these results on our website, along with the reports that accompany them. Our goal is to share the findings so that we can provide you with information to help you provide patient-centered care. If any of these topics, you would like to know more about any of these topics, please let us know. Our email is listed above, and you can see on the screen as casnp@gw.edu. Here's some more information about CA-SNAP resources. You can visit our website to see webinars and reports. We also encourage you to check out our free Cancer Survivorship e-learning series for primary care providers at the link on the screen. That's Cancer Survivorship CenterEducation.org. We have had a lot of oncology professionals complete it and find it very useful. We recently launched our new modules on health promotion and care coordination. Our next webinar will take place on August 20th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Following this webinar, you will receive an email with a recording, evaluation survey to provide feedback on today's webinar, as well as today's slides. Our first speaker for today's presentation is Dr. Lynne Padgett. Dr. Padgett received her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Memphis after completing her MS an EDS education specialist in community counseling from Georgia State University. She completed predoctoral clinical training at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Memphis with a concentration in medical psychology. Dr. Padgett subsequently completed a fellowship in pediatric rehabilitation psychology at the Emory University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Padgett's background includes research, teaching, and clinical practice, most recently at a large integrated care organization. Her interests include cancer survivorship, particularly with the cognitive effects of cancer and cancer treatment and palliative care. She also has interest in dissemination and translation of clinical research findings into community settings. Welcome, Dr. Padgett.
Wish now she had given the track that she's in now.
Thanks. Were you going to introduce the other speakers, or did you want me to go ahead and start first? Totally me dropping the ball. Sorry about that.
It's all you, Dr. Padgett.
Okay. I apologize. So I apologize for looking briefly inept. My phone was ringing, and I was fumbling to cut it off, so I apologize. I think the beauty of my presentation is that it will actually be shorter than my introduction. I am delighted to have the opportunity to speak to each of y'all and to hear again these great presentations that were part of the Biennial Survivorship Conference. I wanted to give you just a brief background information on the conference, sort of what it exists to do, and then one neat takeaway that I think leads into and connects quite closely with the two other presentations that we'll be able to hear. So the conference was held in June of this year in Atlanta, Georgia. It's sponsored by 4 organizations with interest in survivorship: the American Cancer Society, the CDC, Center for Disease and Prevention and Control, Livestrong, and the National Cancer Institute. And those 4 agencies come together to support the conference and organize the speakers and the topics, and to really sort of pull together every 2 years the latest information around cancer survivorship. This year's focus was on multi-level collaboration, so there was a real focus on kind of integrating the experience from the community, patients, caregivers, family members, providers, siblings, all the way through all different kinds of healthcare providers and to healthcare systems. So that was the focus. And if you go ahead and advance the next slide. I have, so that is, and now the next one, sorry about that. And I have sort of one highlight and takeaway point. We had a plenary that focused on international models of survivorship care, and they looked at sort of what's being done in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands, in Canada, and in the U.S. And then there was time for questions and answers. And one thing that really struck me about this was that the take-home message from this entire panel was that cancer patients, caregivers, family members, their needs were determined, so they had a sense of what those needs were, whether it was symptom management or rehabilitation or care coordination. Those needs were determined. Boundaries were sort of ignored. They didn't sort of go, that's the healthcare system's problem, they're just going to have to figure that out, or that's a patient problem, they're going to have to negotiate it with their payer, or researchers do that or don't. So they kind of ignored the boundaries there. And what they put together in these other countries was a research agenda that was driven by survivor and health system needs. How do we carry out the care, and how do we address patient needs, which actually goes far beyond the term cancer survivorship, as you'll hear. So I'd like for you to sort of keep that in mind as you listen to the next 2 presentations that I heard and that were very exciting, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce the conference. So I'll turn it back over to GW.
I think the other 2.
You have been muted.
Thank you so much, Dr. Padgett.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Today's presentation is Dr. Charles von Gunten. Dr. Charles von Gunten is the Vice President of Medical Affairs and Palliative Medicine for the Ohio Health System based in Columbus, Ohio. He's the chairman, Test Committee, Hospice and he's chairman of the Test Committee, Hospice and Palliative Medicine, American Board of Medical Specialties. He's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Palliative Medicine. He's the co-principal for the Education for Physicians on End-of-Life Care, known as EPIC project, and its revision for oncology. He's received the Palliative Care Pioneer Award from the American Cancer Society and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy for Hospice and Palliative Medicine in 2011 when he was only 54 years old. In the same year, he was named a top doctor in the U.S. News and World Report. He's an expert for the Center to Advance Palliative Care on developing hospital-based palliative care programs and faculty for the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. He is particularly interested in the integration of hospice and palliative care into health systems. He has published and spoken widely on the subjects of hospice, palliative medicine, and pain and symptom control. Dr. Von Gunten received a Bachelor's of Arts degree with honors from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island in 1978, and he earned his PhD in biochemistry and the MD degrees with honors from the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in Denver, Colorado in 1988. He subsequently has pursued his residency training in the internal medicine, followed by a subspecialty training in hematology and oncology at the McGraw Medical Center of Northwestern University in Chicago. After joining Northwestern's faculty, he directed programs in hospice and palliative care, education, and research. In 1999, he was recruited to San Diego, where he led the development of education and research programs in the Institute for Palliative Medicine at San Diego's hospital as a provost until 2012. He holds the academic rank of Clinical Professor of Medicine at the University of California in San Diego. Today's presentation by Dr. Von Gunten is about how the pain and other symptom, emotional, practical, and spiritual issues faced by cancer survivors and their families are important components of comprehensive cancer care. Survivorship, supportive care, palliative care are all terms that aim to deliver the same care. Dr. Von Gunten suggests that we shouldn't be distracted by these names, but energized by what can be done. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Von Gunten.
I am delighted to be here for this symposium on the best from the Survivorship Conference in Atlanta, and you've really hit the point of where I want to go with this, that when we're delivering care for cancer survivors, whole patient care, let's focus on the care and not the labels of that. So I'd like to get us started. I think this cartoon from The New Yorker in many ways captures the way cancer care feels from the point of view of a patient or family members. And you can see the doctor here talking to the patient with arrows in his chest, and the doctor says, "I'd like to get your arrow count down." Think about the pain and suffering that comes from cancer and its treatment, and for people that survive cancer treatment, there are a number of things that are like arrows. And our whole goal in comprehensive cancer care is to get that arrow count down so that people can go on to live their lives as they want to live them. So I think it's a fact that our ability to relieve the pain and symptoms and stress of cancer has never been greater in the history of medical care than it is right now. I think the other fact related to that then is we don't need more discovery research. We don't need new ways of relieving suffering of patients with cancer. We need research that helps us get it to the patients who need it. In other words, dissemination science. I think although this is true across medicine that we discover things and never implement them, it is particularly true in this area where we know a lot about physical symptoms, we know a lot about emotional distress, and the practical and social issues and the spiritual issues. What we don't do, as has been illustrated in a number of Institute of Medicine reports, is we don't make it available on a routine basis throughout the country in routine cancer care, and that's what should energize all of us. So this take-home point, there is no difference between palliative care and survivorship care. I think one way to think about this is both groups are looking through the same kaleidoscope. They're just looking at it from different ends. Palliative care grew out of hospice care and end-of-life care and grew upstream. Survivorship care of people that are cured of cancer, but then applying what's known to all people with cancer living at any time. It's the same person. It's the same person, and we need to have that same outline or that same framework for looking at people and to be able to meet those needs, I think, is the key thing you should take away from this talk. And I want to make this point really with two case examples. So I've called this the tale of two women. So let's first talk about Jean, who's a patient of mine, 65-year-old woman. She'd had metastatic breast cancer for 6 years. No question this woman is alive because of the advances we've made in breast cancer management over the last 20 years. She's a former grade school teacher, and she has mets to bone, lymph nodes, liver, and brain. The reason I saw her is that pain was coming on suddenly in her back and her left chest. It was 8 out of 10 in severity. She was wearing a fentanyl 25 microgram per hour patch, and sometimes her pain was 2 out of 10, and that was fine. And she would take the oxycodone Percocets, 10 milligrams oxycodone, 325 of acetaminophen as needed. But there would be these periods when it would be absolute, horrible, racking pain. She also had associated progressive shortness of breath. It would sometimes wake her up at night. It was not related to the pain. And a third issue was that occasionally, ever so occasionally, she would have food blocked in her esophagus when she was trying to eat, and she would need to essentially throw it up to get it to stop, but it didn't happen all the time. The other thing is, of course, she was planning a trip to South America in 3 days. The plan was 5 days to Buenos Aires, then an 11-day cruise with Silversea, and those of you know it, that is the top of the line, gorgeous cruise line, then 3 to 4 days in Santiago. And the goal, of course, for me was how can I get her symptoms under control so she can make this trip, or should she make this trip? She had a history of congestive heart failure in her mother, from which she had died, and she'd heard about, well, her mother had hospice care for 2 days, and she remembered it as her mother had terrible shortness of breath and died right away, and that couldn't possibly be for her. And she would say that she's a glass half empty kind of person. And fortunately, her husband was sort of a glass half full person. The total time I spent with this woman and her husband was about an hour and a half, working through the dimensions that needed to be addressed. So, the question for all of you who are in survivorship research is she a survivor? Well, I hope you're inside you say, well, of course she's a survivor. She's lived longer than expected. Her oncologist thinks, well, that he might have something else for her. She's responded to everything else. Do you think she should go on this trip? Which is a more practical, direct question. She and her husband have been planning this for a long time, but now she's highly symptomatic. Which way do we go? I think those are the kinds of questions that patients often find their standard cancer care doesn't really address. And yet for her, it's incredibly important to her issues. So I think the way we should all approach this is from the broad perspective. We shouldn't be focused, what's the state of her cancer, what's the state of her pain, her shortness of breath. We need to look in the big picture. The overall goals of care, which is what I think of this new field of palliative medicine most brings to standard cancer care, is a goal-oriented rather than a problem-oriented approach. What's the most important thing now to the patient and family? And for her and her husband, the most important thing was to get these symptoms under control, and is there any way to take this trip, which they knew would likely be the last trip they'd ever be able to take. They knew she was dying. They just wanted her to live as long as possible and as well as possible up until that last day. Well, what's the framework to think about patients like Jean? Well, there are four, and this comes from the EPIC project, published more than 15 years ago, and then disseminated by the National Cancer Institute as a specific adaptation for oncology, there are fixed characteristics of the patient. There are things about patients like Jean that we can't change. There are the modifiable dimensions. There are the care system interventions, and then the outcomes. So let's walk through this then as a framework. In this circle, let's imagine this is the patient, and this circle has, that you see in yellow, is all the fixed characteristics of a patient. The diagnosis, her race, her ethnicity, the religion, socioeconomic class. In Jean's case, she had the cancer. She was a Jewish woman, upper middle class, living in the suburbs. Nothing about that is going to change, but they say something about who Jean is. Then if we think about, all right, what are the parts around the patient then that are the modifiable things? And there are a host of them. There are the physical symptoms, the shortness of breath, the pain. But there are the spiritual, cultural, existential issues. Why did Jean think she had this cancer? What did it mean to her? Is as important as the physical things. The economic demands, which for Jean, she and her husband were very well insured and relatively prosperous, although this prolonged period of cancer care had seriously diminished their economic abilities. There are her hopes, her expectations, the social relationships, psychological, cognitive symptoms, the practical caregiving needs. All of these are things that we can modify and help Jean with if they're in our lens as part of comprehensive cancer care. All right, then if that's the patient with what's fixed and what's modifiable, then what are the things that we can do with the health system? I think we mustn't forget family and friends are the largest group of unpaid health caregivers that our patients have. They see us intermittently, but that connection of people, what they know, what they're encouraged to do is enormously important. And in Jean's case, it was clearly her husband, who was kind of a standard guy, but wanted things to be positive, easily getting kind of panicky if he didn't know what he was dealing with. So that broader community is important, as well as the institutions. She had been going to a number of places for her health care, and I represented yet another person in a different healthcare institution trying to help her. And then all those health professionals. I called her oncologist, and her oncologist said, well, I don't really think I have anything more for her, but I haven't told her that yet. But she might be eligible for something, but let's just see if she can get through this cruise. And then what are the outcomes? Patients should be able to report that they feel better. The pain, the symptoms, the emotional, the practical things should all get better, and they'll express a sense of satisfaction, and the quality of life will improve. And it turns out that when you address these things, overall utilization of healthcare goes down. This has been proven over and over, that when you make this a part of comprehensive cancer care, the patient gets better, and overall it's more cost-effective. So, this broad perspective of problems versus goals. Every one of you on this call was trained in the problem-oriented method, where you list the problems, you try and make every problem better by creating a plan for each one, you reassess them every day, and when all the problems are solved, the patient is better. But of course what you should say is, well, that's crazy, because some problems don't get better. A person isn't just the sum of the parts. So a goal-oriented approach where we say, all right, there are so many issues here where we could focus on what's the big thing, what's the overall thing that we're trying to achieve, which helps us prioritize then what's most important. What should we be trying for? In Jean's case, it was help me get through this trip. And then you choose a plan to reach the goals. So I loaded Jean up with a change in her pain management approaches, a way to approach her shortness of breath. She went to GI to have the esophageal dilatation, and she went on that cruise. You'll all be pleased to know she made it through that cruise. She got through it with she had the plan. She and her husband made it through that cruise before they got back. But let me go now to Amy, the second person. Amy was a 45-year-old woman with stage 3 vaginal cancer. She was in investor relations for biotech companies, very high-functioning, dynamic woman, and she'd been treated with the best of chemotherapy and radiotherapy 2 years ago with what all of us in oncology would say is a spectacular success. She didn't have to have an operation. She was able to keep her vagina. She looks, and she was cured. She should be thrilled with us. And of course, the problem was she had continuous leg and abdominal pain, terrible swollen legs for lymphedema, and whenever she tried to have intercourse with her husband, it was deeply, deeply painful. She'd been to multiple survivor programs, but nobody helped her with these particular issues. And she'd had a significant event at age 14. She had been raped. Well, you should, of course, gasp and, oh, vaginal cancer, a history of rape, assault. There are likely a number of things going on for this woman right now that are helping her or impairing her ability to live a full, normal life as a cancer survivor. She'd been married 16 years to an investment financier, and their marriage was now quite shaky. You all know men whose major way of interacting with their spouses emotionally is through sex, and for them that was cut off. She couldn't do it as much as she tried, and it was impacting their marriage, and she had 2 children still at home, really beginning to have problems in school related to these issues at home. She was sad, angry. She was also a glass half empty kind of person, but was in the practical dimension. She now was not bringing in that big income anymore. She was on disability, but they were about to lose their house because without that income, it was very hard to continue to meet their expenses. And of course, the spiritual dimension. Why me? Why would this happen to a good girl? Was the rape her fault? Was the cancer her fault? Was she a bad person? Again, sorting through all of this took an hour and a half. Is she a survivor? Well, of course, all of you would say, of course she is. Both these women are survivors. Both of these women have challenges that need to be addressed, although one we know will die soon, and the other one has a whole life to look forward to, but is it a life worth living because she is as miserable as she is? So the take-home messages, the things that I want you to take home about this is that treating the pain, symptoms, and stress of cancer is as important to our patients and their families as treating the cancer. We need to make palliative care a routine part of comprehensive cancer care. There's no difference between palliative care and survivorship care. It doesn't matter what label you use. It matters that these dimensions are addressed and that patients are treated. What can you do? You can be fighting for the importance of this. Attesting to it, the person with the cancer is as important in the cancer. We need to treat the physical domain, the emotional, the practical, the spiritual, and we need to not engage in this kind of fighting about what we call it. We need to be fighting about making sure that this is available to our patients and our families. We need to stop permitting these divisions to obstruct our progress. I was told this by Chris Castle, who was an enormously influential physician in the country when we were trying to get palliative care recognized as a specialty. And she said, Charles, while the Native Americans were fighting among themselves, the Puritans took over the country. The message is clear that if we don't band together, if we don't have an alliance about what we all can agree on, we won't be able to move this agenda forward. Well, what happened to Amy? She got better. She got this care at a hospice, even though she wasn't dying. There's a lot of expertise in hospice programs. There's no reason you can't take care of people on a fee-for-service basis if that was the expertise. And what I want to do now is show you a video that this was drawn from a fundraising video, but you'll get a catch of what doing this for Amy made a difference for her. So if we could have the video.
Doctors have a great idea of how to cure your cancer, but they don't always know what to do with you when you can't deal with the side effects. And I was very fortunate after 2 years to find San Diego Hospice, and I am going to hypnotherapy. I've been doing it for 10 months. I was looking for some way to live my life comfortably.
What is important is the essence of who we are, and just being with it. It's such a healing process.
When you're suffering, it affects all your relationships. In Amy's case, it affects her husband, her children, all the people she engages with. When that's relieved, those relationships get better.
Instead of seeing all the bad things in my life, I see the good, and it's been fabulous.
So there you have it. Someone whose life was restored to her because she got palliative care. Didn't matter to her that she came to a hospice to get it, but isn't it sad that she had to, that she couldn't find it as part of her own place where she was getting her regular care? With that, I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Von Gunten. Lynn, did you have any discussion pieces that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Dr. Von Gunten's presentation is quite clear and really stresses the importance of not being bound by labels and language, but focusing on the goals of the patient and using a framework for reaching their needs and determining what those are. So I'm excited to hear the next presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, well, our final speaker for today's presentation is Dr. Claire Snyder. Claire Snyder is an Associate Professor of Medicine, the Division of General Internal Medicine and Oncology at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, with a joint appointment in Health Policy and Management at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Her research focuses on the quality of cancer care with an emphasis in two areas: the quality of life and coordination between primary care and cancer providers. She has conducted studies to investigate preventative and comorbid condition care in cancer survivors and has also applied her research to developing survivorship care strategies at Johns Hopkins. In other research, she is investigating whether having cancer patients complete questionnaires about their quality of life and supportive care needs and providing that information to their clinicians improves care quality. Dr. Snyder has held various leadership positions in international organizations focused on the quality of life and quality of care. She is president-elect of the International Society for Quality of Life Research and a former board member. She has served on the Health Services Committee and Quality of Care Committee of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, better known as ASCO. She currently serves on ASCO's task force related to patient-reported outcomes and survivorship care plans. She has received competitive funding from government and foundation sources and has published numerous manuscripts on outcomes assessment and the quality of care. Previously, Dr. Snyder worked at the National Cancer Institute and edited Outcomes Assessment in Cancer, Measures, Methods, and Applications, published in the Cambridge University Press. She began her career in the private sector at Covance Health Economics and Outcome Services, Inc. Dr. Snyder received her BA cum laude in public policy studies with a certificate in health policy from Duke University. She received a Master's of Health Science and Health Policy in 2000 and a PhD in Health Policy and Management in 2005 from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, and currently resides in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Snyder's presentation will review the potential to reduce inefficiency and burden in research and practice by reusing data for multiple purposes, including patient management, quality evaluation, and quality improvement. She will demonstrate this potential using examples related to survivorship care planning and patient-reported outcomes, concluding with a discussion of how these data applications can be connected to serve as a foundation for a learning healthcare system. We are pleased to have you join us today, Dr. Snyder.
Well, thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm pleased to be with y'all this afternoon for this Best of the Biennial webinar, and I'd like to thank the organizers from George Washington University for the opportunity to present today, and obviously Dr. Van Gunten gave a terrific and really personal presentation about the way that cancer affects quality of life and well-being and care management among cancer patients and survivors. And in my talk today, what I'm going to focus on is a little bit more geeky, but it's about how to use data in innovative ways to advance survivorship care and research. So I had the opportunity to my presentation was originally a discussion in the session on innovative uses of data, and I had the opportunity to follow Dr. Christy Eamon from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Dr. Rick Moser from the National Cancer Institute, who discussed survivorship care plans and outcomes measurement, including patient-reported outcomes, respectively. And so what I tried to do in my talk was tie all of that together. And what was clear from their talks and what is clear just in general is that data is a valuable resource. And like any valuable resource, we need to be conscientious stewards of it, which means that we need to reduce, reuse, and recycle. From the reduction side of things, what we try and do with data is to reduce inefficiency and respondent burden. There's a common saying out there that you should measure twice and cut once, and this slide shows the ill effects that can occur if you don't measure carefully before you cut. On the other hand, as this slide points out, cutting is way more fun than measuring. And that's where we're actually pretty lucky, because when it comes to research, you can measure once and cut twice, which is to say that you can collect data or measure outcomes for one application, but use that data in multiple different ways. So that brings us to the reuse part of the cycle. And what I've noted here is that applications include clinical practice, quality of care evaluation, quality improvement, and you can have data that was actually meant for one purpose and use it for multiple purposes. And the way I like to illustrate that is with this cycle here. It starts with collecting the data, and then you can use the data in clinical practice to help manage an individual patient, followed by evaluating the quality of care and quality improvement. And the really great thing about data is that you can do all parts of this cycle, or you can focus on just one or two. So let's walk through this cycle of survivorship using the example of survivorship care plans. And so the cycle starts with collecting survivorship care plan data. In this case, it means actually completing a survivorship care plan. And what is shown here is the ASCO template for the treatment summary and survivorship care plan. So it provides very basic information about the characteristics of the cancer and the treatments received, as well as the plan for follow-up care. And then those data can be used to help manage an individual patient. And this paper here describes how at Johns Hopkins we use a survivorship care plan as part of a one-time transition visit with a nurse practitioner for our breast cancer patients who are completing acute treatment and transitioning to survivorship. So that care plan is meant for that individual patient as her guideline for follow-up care and her summary of her cancer diagnosis and treatments received. But those data can also be used to evaluate the quality of care. And that happens when we actually aggregate data from across many different patients. An example of this is the American Society of Clinical Oncology Breast Cancer Registry pilot, where 20 practices entered data on 2,000 newly diagnosed early-stage breast cancer patients. And those data were used to populate the treatment plan and summaries for individual patient management, but they were also used to produce practice-specific and aggregate quality measures. And then those data can be used to inform quality improvement. So the data I'm showing here are not actually from a survivorship care plan, but they could have been from a survivorship care plan. This is actually a quality indicator that's used by ASCO's Quality Oncology Practice Initiative as to whether chemotherapy was received within 4 months of diagnosis for women who should have received chemotherapy. And what we can see is the bar shows the performance of a given practice, in this case the Michigan Comprehensive Cancer Center, and the horizontal line shows the average performance on the quality indicator, and the asterisk shows the maximum value achieved by any practice. And so what we see is in the spring of 2006, this practice is underperforming in terms of women initiating chemotherapy within 4 months of diagnosis. But this information armed them to improve their care quality such that a year later they were performing at the maximum level. So that was the cycle for survivorship care planning, but let's go through the cycle again, this time focusing on patient-reported outcomes. So I think we're all familiar that patient-reported outcomes represent any report coming directly from patients about a health condition or its treatment. And patient-reported outcomes is an umbrella term that covers an array of outcomes, including things like symptoms, health-related quality of life, functional status, well-being, treatment adherence, and so on. So the first step of the process, again, is to collect these data. At Johns Hopkins, we've developed the Patient Viewpoint web tool, which is designed so that clinicians can assign patients questionnaires to complete, much in the same way that they would order a lab test or an imaging study. Patients receive an email when it's time for them to complete a survey, and they can log on to the system and enter their responses. Those data can then be used in clinical practice. So here what we show is an example score report from a hypothetical patient. And what this score report shows is the patient's most recent score and up to 4 previous scores, with highlighted domains in yellow signifying a score that is potentially concerning, either in absolute terms or representing a substantial change from the previous assessment. So this patient is having particular issues related to fatigue, which is affecting physical function and social activities. And so the patient and clinician armed with this information during the visit can focus their conversation on the issues that are most relevant to that patient and hopefully address those problems. For folks who are interested in this application of patient-reported outcomes, the International Society for Quality of Life Research has developed a user's guide which reviews the considerations involved, the options available, the resource requirements for each option, as well as their relative advantages and disadvantages. And that user's guide is available on the ISAQOL website. And we've also written a summary that's been published in Quality of Life Research. But again, the opportunity for those data to improve the quality of care doesn't have to stop there. It can also be used to evaluate care quality. So here's an example where we aggregate data across patients, the same way we did for the survivorship care plan. And then these are hypothetical data where we can compare our practice's performance in terms of uncontrolled pain and uncontrolled nausea in our practice versus other practices that are similar to ours. And what we see in the green bar is that our practice is doing worse than practice A, but better than practices B and C in terms of uncontrolled pain. On the other hand, our practice is doing worse than practices A and B on moderate nausea, but better than practice C. So our practice can take this information that is patient-reported about their, sorry, I was looking at the question, which I will definitely answer. Anyway, our practice can take this information to figure out what we need to do to improve our performance on pain and nausea. And while ASCO has traditionally focused in its quality oncology practice initiative on indicators that are available from chart reviews, it is now beginning to plan a pilot that will look at patient-reported outcome measures such as pain and nausea as part of its COPE assessment. And once we know how we're performing on patient-reported outcomes, again, we want to improve where possible. And I'd like to thank my colleague, John Brown from University College Cork, who has shared the next couple slides with me. And to orient you to these slides, each dot on the slide represents a surgeon, in this case, a breast cancer reconstruction surgeon. And on the x-axis is the number of operations the surgeon has performed, and on the y-axis is the average scale, the average quality of life score for their patients. And so what we see is this red dot surgeon is performing below average, which is signified by the solid horizontal line. So while it's helpful to know this red surgeon is lower performing, what we really want to do is help him or her improve the quality of care. And this becomes possible when you add interpretable labels to the meaning of the quality of life scores. So what we see here is, on average, patients of the red dot surgeon report that they're satisfied with the shape of their breasts when clothed, whereas the average patient, or the patient of the average performing surgery, reports that their breasts line up when unclothed. And the highest performing surgeon's patients report, on average, that their breasts are equal in shape and size when unclothed. So this information helps the red dot surgeon think about what needs to be improved in their technique such that their patients report better outcomes. So while we've shown the opportunities to reduce, reuse, and recycle data for survivorship care planning and patient-reported outcomes independently, there's even greater potential when you connect the patient-reported outcome data with the clinical information from, for example, survivorship care plans. And then the data can be used not only to evaluate care quality, but also for comparative effectiveness in patient-centered outcomes research and for population monitoring. So if we take the clinical information from our care planning cycle and link that to our patient-reported outcomes from the PRO cycle, put them together, we now have the basis for a learning healthcare system, and can begin to answer questions such as, what are the rates of moderate to severe nausea caused by various chemotherapy treatments in real-world practice as opposed to from clinical trials? And how does the radiation dose affect long-term cognitive function? And what is the association between stage of disease and fatigue? So all of this information builds off of the clinical information linked with the patient-reported outcomes to answer questions in real-world settings about how we can improve the quality of care for cancer patients. And with that, I just wanted to thank the funders who have supported our efforts in this area. And in terms of the question, the website for ISAQOL is, as you said, isaquol.org. And if you look at research publications, there's a link for research, and you can click on research publications and find the user's guide there. So thank you again for this opportunity.
That was wonderful, Dr. Snyder. Thank you so much. Okay. Lynn, did you have any points for discussion?
Yeah, I was intrigued by the fact that Dr. Snyder referred to her presentation as the geekier presentation because what stood out to me as I watched it, and maybe that's because I'm used to sitting sort of in NCI and trying to look at sort of fields as a very large. The field of oncology is very large, and try to see where there are similarities in it to sort of make me feel like I can get my hands around it better. And it's interesting. I actually found several parallels in the presentation. So Dr. Van Grooten was talking about stories, and he talked about patient stories and patient experiences, and the way that we tend to be problem-oriented in our approach to patients, and they list their problems and we solve their problems, and thus the patient should be better. Whereas what we should really be looking at is the goals of the patient. And so their problems are impeding them reaching their goals, and how we do that. And so, taking a more holistic picture at this idea of goals. And then Dr. Snyder was talking about one of the things I tell students sometimes, and I think she illustrated this really well, is data is, people get nervous about data and statistics. Data is just another way to tell a story. So, Dr. Snyder uses her data to tell stories at a different, at multiple levels. So she told about the patient story, with the patient's individualized care plan, and then how that care plan impacts a dyad of two people or maybe more, with the care provider and the clinical practitioner and the patient, and then how then that same data can be used to improve care quality and to feed quality improvement initiatives. So as I was thinking about data as a way of telling stories, and stories as a way of illustrating data, I had a question for each of you, and I'll phrase both of them, and then if you need me to repeat it, that's fine. I'll start with Dr. Van Grooten. How do you, in your system, communicate goal, the achievement of goals, not just solving problems, because of course it's much easier to measure, my pain was less than 4 than it is to measure the variability in patient goals. So how do you communicate those patient goals to your system, whether it's through quality or provider or practice feedback? And then I would turn the question around afterwards for Dr. Snyder, which is to say, how does your group illustrate the story of what's going on? How often do you get to use individual cases as illustrative principles, and how do you balance that tension of focusing on measurable problems versus the big picture goal? So Dr. Snyder, I'll let you think for another minute, and I can repeat the question again. But Dr. Van Grooten, how do you communicate a collection of stories, your data, to your healthcare system?
Right. You illustrate a very important issue that all of us face with our contemporary medical records, which are all based on a problem-based approach, and for each problem gets its own diagnosis, and our contemporary healthcare rests on that as its primary billing mechanism. So you're right that the medical record does not set us up for success in this, and so the way this gets pushed, first of all, is in the notes describing what are the overall goals of care, and this is often the role that the palliative care team plays is articulating that. And then, although we do have our electronic medical record, there is no substitute for the in-person conversation. Palliative care embedded in comprehensive cancer care, where there's a verbal discussion between palliative care, medical oncology, radiation, surgical oncology, and the nurses frequently are the ones to really own that and carry that and make sure that it's carried through across services.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. So, Dr. Snyder, I feel like I babbled on with an 8-part question, so I can try and make it a little more succinct if that would be helpful, or if you've put together an 8-part answer, that's okay too.
Well, I'm not sure I have an 8-part answer, but I think I have an answer to your 8-part question.
Oh, great.
And I actually think it's a great question and a way of thinking about things that we hadn't necessarily thought of. I hadn't necessarily thought of before. But when you raise the question, it occurs to me that the tools that I described, the survivorship care plan tool and the patient-reported outcome measurement instrument, I feel are a way for patients to tell their stories. So a survivorship care plan is really just a brief story of what the patient got, what their experience was, and what they need to do going forward, at the same time that a patient-reported outcome questionnaire is a way for patients in a structured way to report what's going on with them. And certainly the conversation itself is really helpful, but sometimes by putting it in a structured format through a formal questionnaire, certain things emerge that patients and clinicians would otherwise not discuss. So we have examples from our studies where clinicians will say, the patient was more depressed than I was picking up on in our discussions, and patients saying, it never occurred to me to talk about my issues with body image with my doctor because I didn't think that was his problem. But because of the questionnaire, we discussed it today, and it was incredibly helpful, and I feel better. So I think these tools are a way for patients to tell their stories and for clinicians to share the story. So I hope that addressed your 8-part question.
I think it did. Thank you. That was very helpful and really interesting. Is there anyone in the audience who has questions?
If anybody does have a question, go ahead and please use the question and answer chat box on the bottom right of your screen, and we will be able to read those questions to our presenters.
I don't see anyone typing at the moment, so I'll just ask Dr. Von Gunten, I think I've pronounced your name about 3 different ways. I apologize. Dr. Von Gunten. I will ask you, Claire mentioned tools as conversation starters, and Dr. Snyder mentioned tools as conversation starters, and you mentioned training and education of all kinds of providers as something that we need to do to move toward the goal-based approach. What do you see as the ways, either where that's happening successfully, or how tools have a role in that?
Well, I think that like all of our practice, we're informed by tools or archetypes or approaches. So I think related to goal-oriented care, the archetype is the basic interview, which is asking open-ended questions to the patient about how they view their illness, what they understand, what they're hoping for. For most people that I've engaged with in teaching that and seeing it, it's just alien to ask open-ended questions like that. Particularly the question, knowing what you know, what are you hoping for now? tell me how you view your future and what you're hoping it will be. That gives you the overall goals. The huge emphasis on problem-oriented care leads clinicians to dive into interviews with narrow, closed-ended questions that are biologically based. So it takes practice. Now, required rotations with palliative care, either consult services or inpatient units, which are now in virtually all teaching hospitals, and in the better cancer programs are also there. Well, you get a chance to practice it, but the people then don't practice in the same way, because once you've seen the power of it, and particularly how it makes complex cases easier, because when someone has something simple wrong, goal-based care really doesn't matter that much. It's when you have complex problems that interact and where there isn't one fix for them, that you need patients' help in just helping you decide what's the most important thing, all things considered, and then that personal discipline of trying to listen to the patient and not listen to yourself, because I think everyone in American healthcare is fine with autonomy as long as we agree with the patient's decisions. But frequently patients will say something with which we don't agree, or never would occur to us that was important, but it's important for that person. That, I think, is then requires the I think holders of goal-based care. So when you're at tumor boards, when you're at other places where treatment planning is done, to represent it there.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our presenters for sharing your expertise and to our participants for joining us for today's webinar. So in the interest of time, and we want to make sure we get everyone off the call on time, we want to make sure that you are aware of some more information for our CA staff resources. You can visit our website to see the webinars and the reports. We also encourage you to check out our free Cancer Survivorship e-learning series for primary care providers at the link on the screen. That's cancersurvivorshipcentereducation.org. We've had, again, lots of oncology professionals complete it and find it incredibly useful. And we've recently launched some new modules on health promotion and care coordination. Our next webinar is going to be taking place on August 20th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And again, remember that following this webinar, you will receive an email with a recording evaluation survey to provide feedback on today's webinars, as well as the slides. So again, thank you to all the presenters. The discussion was fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Padgett. And we look forward to seeing you guys participate again. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.